A voice cries out in shock as guests react to his sudden arrival.
With a sharp smack sounding, Joan delivers a powerful blow to the girl.
Joan declares her engagement to Charles and insults the girl's cheap fragrance.
The pink-haired girl collapses and begs Joan to stop her physical assault. While the girl weeps, Joan cruelly dismisses her pleas as being entirely useless.
The girl claims Charles's heart will remain hers regardless of his marriage.
Joan towers over her, scolding her for bringing embarrassment to the noble gathering. Joan strikes again as Charles arrives, accusing Joan of being the embarrassment. Onlookers gossip about Joan's shrewish behavior, claiming she has humiliated her entire family. Joan reflects on her awareness of the terrible reputation she has earned. Voices from the past question how her father, Edmund, raised such a child. Labeled a shrew and a simp, Joan admits she only cared about love. A sudden resolution flashes in her eyes to finally protect her one love. Charles's hand catches her mid-strike, commanding her to stop her violent outburst. Joan stares in shock while the pink-haired girl bleeds at her feet. Charles looks down coldly, asking if she has humiliated herself enough for today. He forcibly restrains Joan while protecting the girl weeping on the ballroom floor. Gianna feigns guilt while Charles leaves Joan behind despite her desperate pleas. Narrative text details the history of the Pembroke family and their artistic contributions. Charles is described as a perfect fairy tale prince, mastering every refined art form. Joan recalls her past belief that Charles was her one true destined prince. She watches from a distance as Charles comforts another woman in the light. Mocked as the Empire's greatest simp, Joan's narration turns toward her past sacrifices. Joan remembers her wedding, a dream she once held for her future.
She abandoned her career and hobbies just to please Charles's personal preferences. Her persistence only brought her pain, leading her toward an inevitable dark end.
Joan's father, Edmund, lies in his coffin after she neglected him for Charles. Overwhelmed by grief, Joan cries at her father's funeral and begs for forgiveness. With her last pillar of support gone, Joan's mental state slowly began deteriorating. Sinking into the ocean, Joan finally reflects on the brief life she led. Drowning in the deep, she regrets sacrificing her dignity, career, and father. A faint glug sounds as she realizes her one-sided love was never worth it. A celestial pattern appears as she prays for God to hear her wish. From the watery depths, she desperately pleads for one more chance at life.
She vows never to be a pathetic simp for another person ever again.
A bright light reveals a chandelier as a maid calls out to her. Joan wakes up in a sunlit room looking bewildered by her sudden return. Two maids stare in confusion at the change in their young lady's expression. Sitting in her opulent room, Joan asks where she is while maids wait. A maid presents the gown Joan previously selected for the victory banquet celebration.
Joan recognizes the dress as the trigger for the worst moment of her life.
She touches her face, realizing with shock that she has actually come back. An internal realization confirms she returned 1 week after her engagement ceremony. With a heavy thud sounding, Joan discards the dress, shocking her personal attendants. The maids are bewildered as Joan rejects the gown she once chose. Joan closes her eyes, moving past her former self with a newfound determination.
The maid reminds Joan of the banquet and warns her about Gianna's presence.
Dressed in striking black, Joan reveals she already knows Gianna's whereabouts to her. Joan questions why her gown should please Count Charles, dismissing his opinion. Her maid is bewildered, reminding Joan that Charles is her beloved fiancé. Joan stands resolutely among roses, declaring her intent to break their engagement.
The pink-haired girl exclaims that it is her again as a sudden strike rings out. A sharp slap sounds as the red-haired woman strikes the pink-haired girl across the face. The impact of the blow sends a shock through the silent ballroom. Gripping the girl's hair, the red-haired woman states that she and Charles are already engaged, yet the girl still shamelessly clings to him, adding that her cheap perfume makes her sick. Cowering on the floor of the grand hall, the pink-haired girl begs her to please not hit her anymore. The girl tearfully asks if she can stop, but the red-haired woman leans in to whisper that it is useless. Standing over her rival, the red-haired woman commands her to forget the engagement, declaring that even if they marry, Charles will always be hers, as a forceful movement sounds. Pure rage, the red-haired woman's expression as she prepares another strike. She looms over the girl, reminding her that everyone present is nobility, and she is embarrassing Charles with such behavior. Another sharp slap echoes as the red-haired woman shouts that the girl is the one embarrassing Charles. Amidst the shock, bystanders whisper that she is acting like a shrew and recall her villainous nickname, noting she has completely humiliated the Mortimer family. She acknowledges to herself that she is fully aware of what people say about her. The red-haired woman stands alone, isolated by the judgment of the crowd. Despised as a shrew, a villainess, and a simp, she admits she does not care because of the depth of her desire. Driven by a desperate need to protect her love, she prepares to strike again. A firm hand catches her wrist as a cold voice commands her that it is enough. The red-haired woman freezes in shock as she looks at her injured rival on the floor. Charles stares back at her with cold green eyes full of disdain. Looking down at her, Charles asks if she hasn't embarrassed herself enough. He maintains a tight, punishing grip on her arm in front of the crowd. As he turns away, the pink-haired girl apologizes to Charles, claiming she didn't expect this and blaming herself for upsetting Miss Mortimer, while the red-haired woman begs Charles to wait and listen to her. Narration details the historic Pembroke family, renowned for nurturing and supporting countless artists across the empire. Charles conducts an orchestra, embodying his family's flourishing legacy in music and the arts. Left alone on the floor, the red-haired woman reflects that she believed he was her destined prince from the moment they met. She watches from the shadows as the couple walks together toward a bright future. Noblewomen bet she will chase him again, laughing that she is the Empire's #1 simp, while her inner voice repeats it was all for her love. She recalls, perhaps imagined, memory of a wedding embrace with Charles. Recounting her efforts, she remembers stopping her use of perfume for his allergies and baking the pastries he loved, hoping her persistence would finally awaken his love. Despite her dedication, she felt only disappointment and pain, realizing her persistence was failing her. Her obsession with Charles led to tragedy, as her travels to follow him prevented her from seeing her father's final moments. At the funeral, she weeps over the pink-haired man's coffin, crying out in a desperate apology to her father. Following her father's death, her life remained shrouded in misfortune as she lost her final pillar of support and her mental state deteriorated. As death approaches, she begins to reflect on her brief and tragic life. She realizes with heavy regret that she sacrificed everything for the sake of chasing a so-called love. Sinking into the depths, she regrets giving up her dignity and her perfume career, realizing she neglected her father and forgot their last moments together. She mourns leaving her father alone in his illness, concluding that no one was worth such a sacrifice as a quiet splash sounds in the dark water. She prays to God, asking that if he truly exists, he will hear her final wish. Reaching toward the surface, she begs for one more chance and one more life to make things right. She vows that she will never be anyone's pathetic simp again. A servant's voice calling for her rouses her beneath a grand golden chandelier. Sunlight streams through the windows as a swish sounds, and she wonders who is speaking. With a sudden gasp, the red-haired woman wakes up in her lavish bed. Her two maids stare at her with looks of surprise and confusion. Sitting on a sofa, the red-haired woman bewilderedly asks where she is. Her maid asks what she is talking about, explaining that the banquet is starting and she has found the platinum white dress she prepared to match the count's outfit. The intricate golden details of the dress shimmer in the light. The red-haired woman recognizes the dress with a start, remembering its significance. Memories of her previous life's confrontation at the banquet flash vividly before her eyes. She realizes with a start that she has miraculously returned to the past. She smiles, realizing she has been reborn just 1 week after her engagement. Toss, a maid with a brown hairbun, throws a dress onto the floor as her colleague watches in shock. Her maid with a dark braid asks what she is doing, reminding her that it is the gown she carefully selected for the count. Joan looks away with a slight, knowing smile. The maid reminds Joan that today is the Crown Prince's victory banquet and tells her she must control her temper because of something she saw outside. Joan asks if she saw Gianna, and the maid is surprised to learn that Joan already knew. Her maid tells her the gown suits her perfectly and the Count will love it, but Joan asks what his opinion has to do with her.
Shocked, the maid asks what has gotten into her and reminds her that he is her beloved fiancé. Joan questions the term fiancé and firmly declares that she is breaking off the engagement with him.
The grand palace banquet hall glows with light as noble guests mingle. Guests whisper their jealousy about Charles having such a devoted future wife.
A man asks Charles for a hunting trip, mocking Joan's unrefined interests. Charles remains silent, pensively drinking his red wine amidst the social chatter.
Edward stands alone in his regal attire, observing the crowded hall intently. Charles begins to mention Joan, but a sharp voice interrupts his sentence. A man is startled, recognizing the imposing presence of the crown prince. A noblewoman gleefully announces that Joan Mortimer has finally arrived at the banquet. Edward watches with a stern, focused gaze as the room's attention shifts. Joan enters the golden hall, her dark gown contrasting against the bright interior. Contrast panels show the dazzling banquet hall and Joan's memories of past luxury. A group of noblewomen gossiped, shocked that Joan dared to attend today.
They anticipate a scandal, predicting Joan will cause a scene before Charles.
Margaret smirks behind her fan, certain Joan will cling to Charles immediately. Joan picks up a slice of cake, aware everyone expects her failure.
A desperate voice from the past asks Charles for an invitation to dance.
Joan recalls her previous life where she fruitlessly begged for Charles's attention.
She remembers her former self constantly circling Charles despite his obvious coldness.
Joan's black shoes with rose buckles step firmly across the polished floor. Joan greets Margaret, Sylvia, and Sonia with a bright, unexpected greeting. A brown-haired woman flinches as Joan asks if they were discussing her.
The trio panics, wondering if Joan heard their insults and seeks a confrontation. Joan stands calmly before the three women as they try to feign innocence. Joan begins to reveal her true purpose for approaching the surprise group.
She explains she has wanted to speak with them for a long time.
Joan holds Margaret's hands, complimenting her perfume and expressing a desire for friendship.
Margaret remains skeptical and cold, claiming that Joan is merely being dramatic.
Joan expertly identifies the rosemary and rose fragrances worn by Sylvia and Sonia.
She offers a first test of her family's new perfume under one condition. Joan invites them to share dessert, vowing to prevent her family business's decline.
Gianna stands with Charles and Edward while Joan remains occupied with guests.
Gianna grows suspicious, noting that Joan hasn't even glanced in Charles's direction. Gianna feigns a sudden dizzy spell, prompting Charles to ask if she is unwell.
Charles supports Gianna toward a sofa while the crown prince watches the scene. Joan observes the drama from afar, viewing Gianna's antics as a predictable waste.
Gianna watches Joan's departing back with a calculating and malicious expression. Gianna approaches Joan, suggesting they head over to where Charles is standing.
Joan recognizes the attempt to lure her into a public, humiliating drama. Recalling past physical brawls, Joan resolves to only live for her own sake.
The scene shifts to the bustling banquet hall filled with nobility. Count Charles smiles warmly as he greets the gathered crowd. A guest remarks to Charles that they are jealous of him for having a fiancé who loves him so much. A man with messy brown hair begs Charles to take him along for riding and hunting, while a man with purple-gray hair mocks women who hunt as savages. Charles sips his wine silently as the conversation continues around him. Standing apart from the crowd, the black-haired crown prince watches the scene with a cold gaze. Charles begins to mention Joan, but the crown prince interrupts to ask who exactly is the joke in this situation. The nobles gasp in shock as they recognize His Highness, the crown prince. A woman in a green gown suddenly announces that Joan Mortimer has arrived. The crown prince stares ahead with an intense and piercing expression. Dressed in a magnificent black and gold gown, Joan enters the grand ballroom. Joan never realized how luxurious her life should have been as she stands near the blonde Charles and the dark-haired prince. A group of noblewomen whisper among themselves, surprised that Joan would show up since the girl Gianna is also there.
They gossip that she is definitely going to hit someone in front of Count Charles today.
The purple-haired woman tells them to relax, predicting that Joan will go cling to Charles first. Joan walks through the hall with a slice of cake, knowing that everyone is just waiting for her to make a fool of herself. She recalls a memory of Charles coldly telling her next time when she asked him to dance. Then a flashback to her previous life, Joan offers Charles some cake while he ignores her. She reflects on how all she ever did in her past life was circle around Charles. Her black shoes with rose details step confidently across the floor. Joan approaches the group Margaret, Sylvia, and Sonda. She asks the women if they were just talking about her. Terrified, the noblewomen wonder why she is coming over and if she intends to settle a score.
I stare at her in
disbelief as she stands before them.
Joan continues, stating that she has been wanting to come talk to them for a long time.
She tells them she has wanted to be friends and compliments the Malmaison perfume the purple-haired woman is wearing. Joan identifies the bold blend of pink pepper and amber, noting that very few people in their social circle have the taste to appreciate it. The purple-haired woman looks surprised and tells Joan she is exaggerating. Joan offers a radiant and friendly smile. She correctly identifies Sylvia's rosemary scent and Sonia's rose fragrance. Joan mentions her family is launching a new perfume and offers them the chance to test it first on one condition. The condition is that they eat desserts together to be happy, while she vows not to let her family's business decline this time. The Crown Prince watches as Charles and the pink-haired Gianna stand together.
Gianna wonders what trick Joan is playing, noting she hasn't even glanced toward Charles.
Charles asks Gianna what is wrong and if she is feeling unwell. Charles leads a faint-looking Gianna toward a sofa while the crowd watches.
Joan watches them from across the room, thinking her trip would be a waste if the girl doesn't make trouble.
Gianna stares back at Joan with a suspicious look. Gianna tells Joan that Count Charles is over there and asks if they should go over to him. Joan realizes they are impatient to drag her into another hair-pulling drama. As she walks past the black roses, Joan vows that in this life, she is only living for herself.
Joan smiles brightly at Gianna and flatly refuses to go to Charles. Gianna is visibly taken aback by Joan's sudden and firm refusal. Joan questions Gianna's motives while Gianna tries to maintain her innocent, helpful facade. Joan recognizes the weak, pitiful act as a deliberate provocation to start trouble. A sudden, firm tug sounding, Joan catches Gianna's arm to stop her upset. Joan notes the noble's greedy attention, seeing past their facade of proper manners. Joan resolves to disappoint everyone waiting for her mood and reputation to crumble. Joan walks away with confidence, her elegant dress trailing on the ground. Joan demands Gianna explain the exact nature of the misunderstanding she mentioned. Gianna feigns innocence, claiming she only wishes for Joan and Charles's happiness. A confident and knowing smile touches the red-haired lady's lips. Joan questions Gianna's role, but the girl claims to be a caring friend. Joan mockingly suggests Charles must appreciate Gianna's concern for his personal finances. The intricate black lace of Joan's elegant gown is highlighted. Gianna insults Joan, claiming Charles only loves beauty and bought her dress. Joan suggests Gianna visited Charles's home to secure such an expensive gift. The pink-haired girl looks wounded by Joan's sharp and accusatory gaze. A cold laugh sounding, Joan mocks her rival's transparent and pathetic behavior. Narration observes that some consider social climbing as a simple free meal ticket. Gianna begins to weep, blaming her commoner birth for Joan's supposed cruelty. A sudden voice cries out, declaring that being a commoner is no sin. Rhythmic footsteps sounding, a man enters the center of the grand ballroom. Charles tells Gianna she never has to apologize to anyone for her birth. Charles asks what happened while Gianna feigns guilt for the ongoing conflict. Gianna tearfully vows to stop seeing Charles to avoid further misunderstandings. Joan dryly suggests that since birth is no issue, Charles should marry her. Charles announces that the truth is out and they have nothing left to hide. A sudden uproar sounding, Charles reveals he and Gianna are already married. Shock ripples through the guests while Joan watches the scandalous news break. Sacred doctrines explain that a marriage witnessed by God is an unbreakable bond. The law only recognizes the first marriage performed before a holy priest. Onlookers realize Joan's engagement is invalid and her pursuit of Charles was futile. Guests gossip that Joan's efforts were pointless and she must be devastated. Joan reflects that this revelation is perfect for dissolving her unwanted royal engagement. Publicly breaking the engagement, Joan declares she no longer has feelings for Charles. Joan turns away as symbolic red flowers bloom, marking a new beginning.
The pink-haired Gianna reacts with visible surprise to something she has just heard. Gianna offers to help mend the cold relationship between the red-haired Joan and Count Charles, but Joan inwardly recognizes Gianna's white lotus smile and deliberately clueless tone as a manipulation. Looking back at a past conflict, Joan realizes that Gianna's weak and pitiful behavior is just a calculated attempt to provoke her into an outburst. Her movement is halted by a sudden, firm tug sounding as Gianna grabs Joan's wrist to keep her from leaving. Joan notes the hypocrisy of the eavesdropping nobles, realizing they are all pretending to be proper while eagerly monitoring her every move. Bystanders watch the tension between the two women with wide-eyed interest as the sound of their whispering fills the room. Dismissing the opinions of the gathered nobles and Gianna's attempts to rival her,
Joan vows that everyone will be disappointed by her expected behavior today.
Joan's rose-detailed shoes step forward confidently. Joan demands that Gianna provide a proper explanation for what exactly this misunderstanding is supposed to mean. Gianna claims she only wants the couple to be happy and hopes they do not misunderstand each other on her account. A knowing smirk plays on Joan's lips. Joan questions who exactly Gianna is to Charles, and Gianna smugly responds that she is just a friend who cares about him, telling Joan not to overthink it. Joan mockingly suggests that Charles must be thrilled to have Gianna monitoring his financial status and bank account. The shimmering details of Joan's dark and luxurious gown glint in the ballroom lights. Gianna retorts that Charles loves beautiful things and notes that he personally bought her the dress she is wearing because it suited her perfectly. Joan's hand reaches out to touch the fabric of Gianna's expensive gown. Joan points out that there's no way Gianna could afford such an expensive dress on her own. Joan suggests that even if Gianna didn't show the dress off at the shop, visiting Charles's house to display it multiple times would have been worth the effort. Gianna's face pales as the implication of her private visits hits her. A short, sharp laugh escapes Joan. Joan reflects on the proud nobles who view their status as a free meal ticket, never realizing they are essentially selling themselves to the highest bidder. Gianna tearfully apologizes, claiming it is all her fault and suggesting she is only being looked down upon because she is a commoner. A sudden, loud shouting as a voice declares that being born a commoner is not a sin. Her attention is taken by a series of firm steps sounding as a man purposefully approaches the scene. Count Charles arrives and tells Gianna she has no reason to apologize to anyone for her birth. Charles asks if Gianna is feeling unwell while she continues to blame herself, claiming she shouldn't be by his side, making Joan misunderstand and promising never to see him again. Gianna's face is covered in tears as she plays the part of the victim. Joan flatly suggests that if Gianna's birth isn't an issue, Charles should simply hurry up and marry her to make her a countess. Charles looks down at Gianna and decides that since the truth is already out, there is nothing left to hide from the public. The room is filled with a collective gasp as Charles announces that he and Gianna have already married in a secret country chapel ceremony. The crowd breaks out in a frantic buzz of shock, excitement, and fresh gossip over the scandalous revelation of a secret marriage. Narration details the sacred nature of marriage in this world, guided by holy doctrines as a bond witnessed by God. Holy laws are cited regarding how society and the church only recognize the first marriage witnessed by a priest. The noblewomen realize that because divorce is invalid, Joan's engagement is officially void and her past efforts were pointless, assuming she must be breaking down inside. A purple-haired noblewoman watches Joan's reaction intently through the chaos. Joan reflects that in her past life, she never knew they were secretly married, realizing this is perfect because public opinion will now help her dissolve the royal engagement. Joan addresses Charles directly, stating she no longer has feelings for him and is officially breaking off their engagement. The deep red hair of the notorious villainess remains still.
Guests assume Joan's rejection is merely a tantrum to get Charles's attention. Gianna reveals a sly, triumphant smile as she clings to the prince. Joan appears serene and satisfied, surrounded by beautiful, blooming purple roses.
From the shadows, the dark-haired Prince Edward Lancaster observes the unfolding drama.
Charles stands in disbelief, unable to comprehend why Joan would suddenly leave.
A bewildered expression crosses Joan's face as the crowd continues to speculate.
A sharp rustle sounding, a voice asks if the previous statement was unclear.
Joan restates her decision to break the engagement, treating it as non-negotiable.
A quiet step sounding, the tension between the two former lovers peaks.
Charles breaks into a cold sweat as Joan looms over him with confidence.
A royal scroll confirms that the emperor's engagement decree had been finalized.
Charles's father explains that their noble status depends entirely on the emperor's favor. The elder warns that defying the royal will puts their entire family in danger.
A heavy question about duty to family is posed to the young man.
His father reminds him that Joan's sincere affection is a rare stroke of luck. The older man notes that Joan is a daughter who brings peace of mind. Charles remembers Joan's past joy when the marriage was first granted. A sudden flinch sounding, Charles pulls his arm away from Joan's touch. The memory captures Joan's heartbroken expression following her fiancé's cold rejection. Charles questions if Joan is unhappy, completely misreading her past feelings. The prince watches Joan's retreating form, lost in his own troubled thoughts. He wonders why she would discard the engagement she once worked so hard for. The grand ballroom features a glittering chandelier and ornate golden architecture. Clinging to Charles's arm, the pink-haired Gianna questions why he is hesitating during such a golden opportunity. Looking away coldly, Charles tells Gianna not to say another word and to go rest. Gianna stands alone and looks bewildered as the guests around her continue to whisper. A quick clink sounding, Joan holds her wine glass and calls Charles a coward for lacking the guts to decide and take responsibility. Charles argues that both families must sign an agreement to dissolve an engagement. He continues that it also needs the emperor's approval, making the process complicated. A confident smirk plays on Joan's lips as she stares at Charles. Declaring that there is no time to waste, Joan turns to tell her father immediately. A sharp rustle sounding, Joan walks away from the stunned blonde-haired man. Chibi-style guests watch the drama while eating snacks and gossiping about the scene. A sudden pop sounding, colorful confetti rains down as the victory celebration continues. Attendants carry trays of refreshments while musicians provide a melodic background for the banquet. A nobleman bows to Prince Edward and congratulates him on another flawless victory. Edward gives a slight nod, his red eyes looking distant and unimpressed by the praise. Three noble women stand together and whisper about the crown prince's arrival. Blushing, the purple-haired lady remembers the banquet's purpose and hurries to offer her congratulations. Edward stands with his arms crossed while the guests around him remain hesitant to approach. A close-up highlights Edward's sharp features and his striking, intense gaze. The golden embroidery and dark fur of Edward's military uniform are shown in detail. Edward turns his back to the crowd, hiding a rolled scroll behind them.
The noblewomen react with pure disbelief to her declaration, confirming she really intends to end the engagement. Whispers among the crowd suggest Joan is merely throwing a tantrum in anger to get Charles to coax her. Gianna wears a subtle, triumphant smile as she watches the fallout. Joan smiles calmly amidst the social storm, unaffected by the judgment. The black-haired crown prince watches the unfolding drama with an intense gaze. Intricate gold embroidery shines on the dark fabric of the prince's uniform. Charles is left bewildered by Joan's sudden and firm rejection, wondering why she would say such a thing. A comical, confused chibi-style Joan appears briefly. A sharp, tight clench sounding as Joan grips her dress and asks Charles if she was not being clear enough with her words. Joan reiterates her decision, emphasizing that it is not a threat and calling out Charles's own long-held desire to be with someone else. Joan leans in close to Charles, asking if she needs to speak even louder for him to understand her decision. A hand rests on an official decree, confirming that the royal engagement decision has been finalized by His Majesty. An older, gray-haired man scolds a younger, blonde-haired man for making a significant decision so carelessly without consulting him. The older man reminds him that their noble standing was granted by the emperor, not earned by themselves. He questions if the blonde man intends to defy the emperor's will and endanger both of their families. He continues his lecture, asking the younger man what has become of his duty to his family. The older man notes that other, more prestigious families have taken the initiative to approach them, questioning if the blonde man thinks such an opportunity comes often. With a slight smile, the older man concludes that an obedient child is the kind who lets a parent rest easy. In a flashback, the blonde man recalls being overjoyed when the emperor personally granted his marriage to the smiling, red-haired Joan. The flashback ends as Joan pushes his arm away. Her expression has turned cold and serious. She looks at the blonde man and asks if he is not happy about the engagement. Joan stands before an archway, looking up at him expectantly. When he fails to respond, she answers for him with a simple no, leaving him wondering why she would suddenly want to end things. The scene shifts to a grand ballroom, indicated by a large, ornate chandelier. The pink-haired Gianna urges the blonde man, Charles, not to hesitate, calling the situation a golden opportunity. Charles looks down at her with a stern expression, telling her not to say another word. Gianna looks flustered and embarrassed as other party guests notice the tension. Across the room, Joan sips a glass of champagne, calling Charles a coward who lacks the courage to either refuse or take responsibility. Charles argues that dissolving an engagement requires both families to sign an agreement. He adds that it also needs the emperor's approval. but Joan cuts him off, asking if he truly knows what needs to be done. A sinister smile spreads across Joan's face. She turns to leave, announcing that she will tell her father immediately, as nearby guests begin to whisper. The red-haired girl walks away through the crowd. In a comical chibi scene, the party guests gossip excitedly about the unfolding drama. A hand holding a rolled document suddenly appears before Joan, stopping her as the crowd looks on. The scene briefly pans over the party, where musicians are playing for the guests. The black-haired Crown Prince Edward is praised by a man for his repeated victories on the battlefield. Edward gives a slight, silent nod of acknowledgement.
Nearby, a group of 3 noblewomen gossip amongst themselves.
A woman with long purple hair remembers that this is the Crown Prince's victory banquet and decides she must go offer her congratulations.
The women approach Edward, who is surrounded by a crowd of admirers.
Edward stands with a distant expression, seemingly unfazed by the attention.
A close-up shows the intricate gold and blue details on his royal uniform.
Seen from behind, Edward holds a rolled scroll as he moves through the party.
Couples dance across the ballroom floor while Charles stands in the middle of the music. Charles realizes he must reach Joan first, regardless of what happens next. Gianna is left standing in shock as Charles suddenly rushes toward the exit. Determined and frantic, Gianna realizes she cannot let Charles catch up to Joan. A heavy thud sounding, Gianna purposefully stumbles into a waiter to create a scene. A sudden splash sounding, Gianna collapses to the floor as red wine spills everywhere. Charles flinches and stops in his tracks as a voice cries out for Gianna. Cradling the girl, Charles hears Gianna feign guilt and claims she does not want to hurt anyone. Surrounded by purple roses, Edward watches the staged accident with a look of pure boredom. Edward exudes a crushing pressure that only the Crown Prince can project. Guests point toward Edward and identify him as the powerful and distant Crown Prince. The purple-haired lady gushes over Edward's handsome face, finding it difficult to breathe near him. A guest admits she is scared of the Crown Prince's stern look in the rumors. Edward insisted on going to the front lines, despite his royal status. Scenes from the battlefield show Edward's bravery and skill during the violent war. Narrations reveal rumors of Edward being a cruel warrior whose armor is dyed with blood. Finding the danger charming, the purple-haired lady admits she desperately wants to dance with him. Guests note that Edward has not invited anyone to dance and seems to be in a bad mood. The purple-haired lady stares at Edward while clutching her closed ham. A sudden snap sounding, the lady opens her fan to signal her intentions to the prince. Narrative text explains that using a fan to hint at something is considered a daring move. Edward looks toward the women and asks what they want with a cold expression. A quick shiver sounding, the chibi ladies tremble under the prince's terrifying and icy stare. The women panic and wonder why the crown prince seems so incredibly angry. A guest tries to justify his mood, suggesting he is deep in thought regarding national affairs. In reality, Edward is distracted and wonders how Joan is doing at this moment. 2 noblemen tell Edward that minor banquet quarrels are common and not worth his time. Looking down at them, Edward bluntly states that the situation does irritate him. Edward scolds the nobles for slandering a girl's reputation and turning a blind eye to her despair. 2 noblemen look on in confusion, wondering who Edward could possibly be referring to. The brown-haired man suggests that the banquet drama is a private matter and outsiders shouldn't interfere. Edward argues that public interference would only invite more gossip and worsen Joan's current situation. Watching Charles comfort the pink-haired girl, the crown prince questions why the fiancé isn't going after Joan. A sudden crack sounding, Edward's grip tightens until his wine glass shatters into pieces. Guests panic and ask if His Highness is all right, noting the blood dripping from his hand. Ignoring the worried crowd, Edward walks away and bluntly tells the guests to excuse him. Outside in the rain, an attendant tries to stop Joan from taking the crown prince's favorite horse. Joan insists that if the prince has an issue with her borrowing it, he can confront her himself. A sharp rustle sounding, the red-haired lady mounts the black steed as blooming pink flowers surround her. Joan explains she will ride across the wasteland to avoid the detours caused by the collapsed city roads. A rhythmic thud sounding, Edward sprints through the palace halls with his heavy black cloak billowing behind him. The crown prince reaches the large exit doors, looking out into the cold, rainy night. His attendant reveals that Joan rode off on his horse but left a small note of thanks. Drenched and blushing, Edward takes the paper scrap and stares at it with an intense, focused expression.
The view widens to show numerous couples dancing gracefully in the ballroom. Charles stands alone on the dance floor, his gaze fixed forward. His expression is grimly determined as he resolves to reach Joan first. Charles strides towards the exit while Gianna watches him leave with a worried look.
Gianna resolves that she cannot let him catch up to Joan. Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp crash sounding as she deliberately collides with a waiter, sending a tray of drinks flying. Gianna falls to the floor amidst the spilled wine, causing Charles to turn back in surprise. Charles rushes to her side, calling out her name as he helps her up from the floor. Gianna looks up at him with teary eyes and apologizes. She insists she's fine and tells him not to worry, claiming she never wants to hurt anyone. From a distance, framed by purple roses, the Crown Prince Edward observes the scene with a neutral expression. Edward stands alone, his powerful aura creating an invisible barrier that keeps the other guests at a distance. One of the noblewomen asks her friends if they see him, excitedly pointing out the Crown Prince. The purple-haired woman thinks that his handsome face becomes clearer the closer she gets, making it hard to breathe. Another woman admits that his stern look, combined with the rumors about him, makes her feel a bit scared. A narration box explains that, as the Crown Prince, Edward is meant to be heavily protected. The narration continues, stating that he repeatedly volunteered for the front lines, as an image shows his family crest over a grim battlefield. Narration describes the black-haired prince as an undefeated hero who restored his family's glory and earned the nation's praise. Despite rumors of his cruelty and bloodlust, the gathered noblewomen find his dangerous aura incredibly charming. The purple-haired woman daydreams about dancing with the prince, completely ignoring the conversation of her companions. Her friends observe the prince's visible anger, guessing that he has no desire to dance with anyone tonight. She clutches her ornate fan tightly, her gaze remaining fixed on the prince across the room. Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp snap sounding as she opens her fan to hide her expression. Narration explains the strict social codes regarding how women in high society use fans to communicate subtle messages. The black-haired prince notices the intense scrutiny and offers a brief, dismissive response. A comical chibi version of the three noblewomen shows them trembling in fear under his intense gaze. They whisper to one another in terror, wondering why the prince appears to be so incredibly furious. The women huddle together, deeply intimidated by the weight of the prince's cold and oppressive presence. One woman nervously suggests that he must be preoccupied with thinking about serious national affairs. In reality, the prince is only concerned with how the red-haired Joan is currently faring after the earlier conflict. Two noblemen advise the prince to ignore the common social drama of the banquet, claiming it isn't worth his concern. The prince admits that the current situation and the behavior of the guests are actually quite irritating to him. He condemns the nobles for their hypocrisy in slandering a girl's reputation while ignoring her obvious distress. The confused listeners wonder if the prince is actually referring to the notorious red-haired Joan Mortimer. One nobleman argues that the matter is a private concern and that outsiders should not interfere. The prince agrees, but notes that Joan's own fiancé should be the one taking responsibility for her. He watches as the blonde Charles remains with the pink-haired Gianna, completely neglecting his responsibilities toward Joan. Her movement is halted by a sudden, sharp crack sounding as the prince crushes his wineglass in anger. The concerned nobles rush to his side, asking if His Highness has accidentally injured his hand. Blood drips from the prince's clenched fist, a stark testament to his mounting rage and lack of restraint. Without another word, he turns and exits the grand ballroom, leaving the crowd stunned by his departure. Outside the palace, a heavy downpour drenches the trees and grounds under the dark night sky. Joan ignores the frantic pleas of a servant as she prepares to take a horse in the rain. She tells the servant the prince can address the issue with her personally if he has a problem with it. Joan mounts the black steed, noting with a playful smirk that the animal seems to like her. Determined to avoid the detour, she gallops off into the rainy wasteland toward her home. Inside the palace, the prince moves with purpose as he walks through the grand entrance hall. He walks through the long corridors, his expression set in a grim and focused line. Her attention is taken by a sudden, quick push sounding as he opens the heavy double doors. A panicked servant informs him that Joan took his favorite horse and left a note behind. The prince stares at the paper, his cheeks flushing with a light blush as he reads the message.
A childhood memory shows young Edward frantically chasing after Joan through a sunlit, blooming garden. A sudden thud sounding, the young boy trips over a stone and tumbles onto the grass. Scraped and bleeding, young Edward begins to sob loudly while sitting beneath the hanging purple wisteria.
A sharp tug sounding, young Joan returns and playfully pulls on Edward's ear to get his attention. Joan scolds the boy for being a sickly crybaby and questions his ability to be her attendant. Despite her teasing, the young girl carries the crying Edward home on her back through the tall grass. Clinging to her, Edward asks if an attendant's true purpose is to be a guard who protects her. Joan turns her head back with a curious look, wondering what is on the young boy's mind. Vowing to protect her forever, Edward's declaration makes young Joan laugh with genuine happiness. The scene shifts to the present, where the dark palace towers stand silent under the endless rain. The note mocks Edward, telling him to take a carriage or walk back like a crybaby. The attendant nervously asks if he should go to Joan's residence tomorrow to retrieve the horse.
Edward puts the note in his pocket and insists on going to see Joan himself.
Chibi Edward's eyes sparkle with excitement as he considers this horse thievery a fated opportunity to see her. Inside a lavish manor, Joan's father sits on a white sofa while a butler stands nearby. The lord smokes a pipe while the butler reports that their monthly sales have dropped again. A finger tap sounding, the butler points out that their suppliers are also reducing their shelf space. The red-mustached lord looks grim as he learns that competitors are poaching their staff. Joan's father stresses the need to analyze market competitors and speed up the development of new perfumes. A sudden cough sounding, the lord's pipe smoke causes him to gasp for air in distress. The worried butler rushes over to his master, who insists he is fine and knows his own limits. The lord maintains that the family business is the most important thing to focus on right now. A frantic maid bursts into the room declaring that Joan caused a massive scene at the royal banquet. The lord's eyes narrow into a sharp, cold gaze as he processes the scandalous report. The maid reports that Joan got into a fight, insulted her fiancé, and caused a public uproar. With a look of utter despair, the maid adds that Joan publicly demanded to break the engagement. The butler announces that the young lady is already on her way back from the venue. The lord remembers how Joan once begged and cried for him to make this marriage happen. Adjusting his glasses, the butler suggests that the young lady must have had a very good reason. The lord tells the maid not to dwell on the drama and orders her to fetch a specific item. Surprised and confused, the butler and maid exchange glances as the lord commands them to hurry. Joan looks down at the black horse's hooves splashing through puddles, reflecting on the vast world. Riding through the storm, she admires the beauty of the open wasteland and the cool, sweet breezes. Reaching toward the sky, Joan celebrates her newfound freedom to finally be herself once again. Arriving at the grand gates of her manor, Joan prepares to face the consequences of her actions. Riding through the rain, Joan returns home and greets her father. The lord, his butler, and a maid wait to receive the daughter. Holding his pipe, the red-mustached lord claims he can handle the scandal. A maid presents Joan with a tall, sparkling strawberry parfait. Joan argues she is grown, but her father insists she remains his girl. The lord promises to support whatever decision Joan makes for her future. A dark premonition shows Joan weeping over her father's funeral casket. Joan embraces her father while he comforts her against the cruel gossip. Joan questions why her father is blindly taking her side so quickly. The father declares his daughter is his top priority regardless of the world. The maid encourages Joan to change clothes before her dessert melts away. Smiling, Joan tells her father that she has a specific request. A close-up highlights Joan's intense violet eyes and her determined expression.
Her attention is taken by a sudden, quick trip sounding as a young boy falls while chasing little Joan. Her attention is taken by a sudden, loud thud sounding as the boy hits the grass. Her attention is taken by a sudden, loud cry sounding as the young boy weeps over his scraped knee. Little Joan scolds him for being a weakling, pulling his ear as he continues to sob over his injury. She mocks his constant crying, questioning his ability to serve as her attendant in the future if he is this useless. Despite her harsh words, little Joan ends up carrying the crying boy on her back through the garden. He asks her if being an attendant means he will eventually get to protect and guard her.
Little Joan looks back at him with a confused and curious expression on her face.
The boy vows to protect her forever, earning a happy smile and words of encouragement from his childhood friend. The scene returns to the present, showing the palace towers standing silent and cold in the pouring rain. The note mocks the prince, telling him to find his own way back and calling him a crybaby. The servant offers to go to Joan's residence tomorrow morning to retrieve the prince's favorite horse. The prince declines the offer, stating that he will personally go to get the horse back himself. A comical chibi version of the prince looks determined, his eyes shining with newfound and intense excitement. The grand ballroom chandelier glows brightly, marking the conclusion of the evening's events at the palace. Back at the manor, a man with averted dark red hair sits quietly while a silver-haired butler waits nearby. The dark, red-haired man hears reports of dropping sales targets. Retailers are reducing shelf space due to the continued decline. Staff members are being poached by rival fragrance companies. The master demands accelerated development and analysis of the market. His chest rumbles with a series of heavy, raspy coughs sounding. The silver-haired butler rushes over, but the master refuses rest. He insists that the family business remains the most urgent matter. Her attention is taken by a sudden, quick splash sounding. A maid informs the master of Joan's disturbance at the banquet. The man's eyes narrow with deep frustration and mounting anger. She reports that Joan argued loudly and insulted her fiancé. Joan publicly proposed an official annulment of the royal engagement. The butler reacts with shock as the maid says Joan is returning. The father recalls how desperately Joan once begged for this marriage. The butler suggests there must be a reason for her actions. He orders the servants to prepare a specific item immediately. The staff is stunned by his surprising choice of response. Joan gallops through the rain, marveling at the vast world. She finds the endless rain and cool wind incredibly sweet. This ride gives her the freedom to truly be herself. The red-haired girl arrives at the manor's grand gates. Joan bursts inside, happily announcing her return to her father. Her father greets her warmly despite the reports of her behavior. He claims to have already prepared a way to handle things. Joan is delighted when presented with her favorite strawberry parfait. Joan claims she's grown up, but her father disagrees. He promises to support her regardless of her marital decisions. Flickering memories show a somber funeral and her father's casket. Joan steels her resolve to prevent a repeat of history. Joan hugs him as he dismisses the social slandering. She is moved by his immediate and unconditional loyalty. He vows to stand by her even if the world refuses. The maid urges Joan to eat before the dessert melts. Joan tells her father she has a serious business request. Her gaze sharpens with newfound focus and strategic intent.
Joan asks if her father is hesitating and offers business advice. Joan warns that simple packaging changes cannot save their classic product lines. A sudden snap sounding, Joan argues they might lose their loyal customers. The Lord mentions their development of new product lines to the Butlin. Joan expresses doubt about relying solely on their current small team of perfumers. A heavy bang sounding, Joan slams her fan to denounce pointless competition.
Joan notes that the end of the wars made spice transportation cheaper. Visuals illustrate how new perfumes have completely saturated the current market. Joan argues that quality won't win against those who captured the market.
The chibi-style characters look stressed as the business discussion turns very serious. A sudden cough sounding, the Lord suggests that Joan does not need to rush. A letter reveals the Lord's deep guilt over his daughter's unhappiness. Standing at a grave, Joan vows to act rightly without further delay. Joan proposes a 1-month trial period to implement her new business strategies. Joan bets her involvement on the new perfume reaching #1 in sales. In a high-ceilinged library, Joan begins climbing a wooden ladder. The maid panics over the danger, but Joan finds the ladder firmless. Joan turns back to tell her maid that she needs some assistance. Joan whispers her plan, and the maid nods in quiet accompaniment. Joan reaches for a book as her long red hair flows behind her. A sudden slip sounding, Joan's heel loses its footing on the shelf.
Joan's eyes widen in terror as she begins to tumble off the ladder.
A sharp rustle sounding, a strong hand reaches out to catch the girl. Edward catches Joan and scolds her for being so reckless with her safety. A quick thud sounding, Joan pushes against his chest to be let down. Joan claims she would have returned his horse without him coming there. Edward looks down at Joan and admits he came specifically for her. A sudden crash sounding, the prince catches a falling book to protect Ton. Joan feels a surge of nervousness due to the prince's extreme proximity. Blushing, Edward looks at Joan and begins to say something very personal. A quick tap sounding, Edward informs the lady that she is stepping on him. Joan sheepishly lifts her foot and offers a blushing, awkward apology. Joan apologizes for the trouble her broken engagement caused the royal family. Holding books, Edward asks Joan what her true personal feelings are. Edward asks if she would reconcile with Charles if he returned. Joan reacts with chibi-style fury, making Edward find her sensitivity intriguing. Joan dismisses him for work, but Edward suggests a writing date tomorrow. Chibi Joan pushes Edward away, telling him she is very busy and he must return the horse before catching a cold. A heavy thud sounding, the large manor doors slam shut as the crown prince is left outside. Edward stands in the rain with his horse, looking bewildered by the lady's sudden cold dismissal. The prince realizes that Joan was truly rushing him out because she had better things to do. Imagining Joan declaring her hatred for him, Chibi Edward and his horse react with exaggerated, comical despair. Clutching the reins, Edward reflects on the broken engagement and wonders why he even returned to the capital. The prince looks miserable as Joan's previous insults about wanting someone else echo endlessly in his mind.
Edward leads his horse home while a messenger boy with a delivery bag walks toward the manor. The messenger hands a letter from Charles to the maid, who has been waiting by the door.
The maid smiles, noting that the lady specifically instructed her to wait for this delivery.
She offers to share her thoughts on the family business. Joan argues that changing packaging alone is a failing strategy.
She warns that they risk losing their most loyal customers.
She proposes the development of an entirely new product line.
Joan questions if relying on current perfumers is sufficient. Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp slam sounding.
She points out that post-war trade makes ingredients more accessible.
New competitors are flooding the market with various exotic scents. She insists they need a different path to seize the market. A comical chibi scene shows the tense atmosphere in the room.
Her father urges patience, but Joan internally senses a deadline. A heartfelt letter reflects his desire for her simple happiness.
Standing at a grave, Joan vows to follow her beliefs.
She sets a firm 1-month deadline for her new plan.
Her father and butler are left speechless by her confidence. Joan proposes a 1-month trial for her perfume project, wagering her future silence on business matters if it fails to rank first.
The red-haired girl climbs a tall wooden ladder in the manor library while her maid watches from below.
The maid warns that climbing is too dangerous for a lady, but Joan dismisses the concern and says she needs help. Pausing on the ladder, Joan looks back at her maid and mentions she has a specific task requiring her assistance. Joan touches her maid's face gently, assuring her that she understands the situation perfectly.
High atop the ladder, the red-haired girl reaches out her gloved hand to retrieve a specific book from the shelf.
Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp thud sounding as her foot slips off the wooden rung. Fear fills the girl's face as she loses her balance and begins to fall backward toward the library floor. Her attention is taken by a sudden, quick grab sounding as a pair of strong arms catches her midair. Prince Edward holds Joan securely, criticizing her for being reckless and nearly getting herself seriously injured. Her attention is taken by a sudden, light click sounding as the black-haired prince finally releases his firm grip on her. Joan notes that she would have returned his horse eventually, but Edward clarifies that the horse was not his reason for coming.
Standing at the base of the ladder, Edward looks up and reveals he came specifically to see her.
Her attention is taken by a sudden, loud whack sounding as a heavy book falls directly onto the prince's head. Joan feels crowded by his presence and internally notes that the prince is standing far too close to her. Edward attempts to speak to her, but he appears flustered and cut off by her cold demeanor. Joan intentionally stomps on the prince's foot, causing him to react with a look of stunned surprise. She offers a superficial apology while lifting her skirts in a mockingly polite and dismissive gesture. Joan assumes he is there regarding the annulment and apologizes for any trouble her decision caused the royal family.
Edward insists his visit is entirely of his own accord and has nothing to do with his father's royal business.
He asks her directly if she would consider reconciling with Charles if the blonde man ever returned for her. A comical chibi Joan erupts in anger, asking if the prince came all this way just to provoke her. Joan dismisses him to focus on her perfume business, but Edward offers to go horseback riding tomorrow to clear her head. A chibi version of Joan pushes the prince away, urging him to take his horse and leave before he catches a cold. Her attention is taken by a sudden, heavy slam sounding as the large mansion doors are shut. Outside, in the night rain, the prince stands with his horse, looking back at the now closed entrance of the manor. Edward is haunted by the memory of Joan's harsh rejection and her claims that she hates him. The black-haired questions why he is dwelling so negatively on the situation after the engagement was broken. Edward walks his horse through the damp streets, still unable to shake her cold and dismissive words from his mind. The scene shifts to the bustling town during the day, where a messenger arrives on horseback. A young messenger delivers a sealed letter from Charles to Joan's brown-haired maid at the entrance. The maid smiles as she accepts the letter, noting that Joan had instructed her to wait there for this arrival.
Entering the library, the maid assumes Joan will be overjoyed to receive a letter from her former fiancé.
Joan admits she was absorbed in a picture book while the maid notes her lifelong love of romance. A sharp slice sounding, Joan uses a letter opener to cut through the red wax seal. Joan notes that invitations used to go to Charles, but this is the opportunity she anticipated. The chibi maid encourages Joan to read it, hoping the pair will reconcile through this invitation. Looking at the envelope, Joan coldly decides that she needs to deal with this matter once and for all. The maid gasps in horror as Joan burns the letter over a candle, declaring she has zero interest. The scene shifts to a wooden shelf filled with various ornate and colorful perfume bottles. Joan praises the silver-haired perfumer's bold ingredients, but forbids him from releasing any new products to the public. The man is frustrated by the wait, but Joan argues he still thinks she values romance over business. Gianna berates a cowering worker, demanding to know why she hasn't been served champagne yet. The worker offers her apologies while the pink-haired lady demands her usual drink immediately. The worker explains the development area is restricted, but the pink-haired woman calls her a lowly pauper. Declaring the manor as her property, the pink-haired lady violently pushes the worker to the ground. Joan appears among blooming roses and demands to know what the pink-haired intruder is doing there. Smirking, the lady claims she is there to inspect the business operations and see how Joan is doing. Joan reveals she burned the letter without reading it, causing the visitor to mock her impulsive mistakes. A waiter brings a glass of champagne to the guest while Joan watches with a growing sense of fury. A close-up highlights Joan's eyes narrowing as her anger toward the arrogant guest reaches its peak. A sudden clatter sounding, Joan knocks the tray away and questions who the woman thinks is in charge. A quick gasp sounding, the visitor recoils in shock as the champagne glass shatters on the floor. Joan looms over her, asking how a nobody like her dares to drink wine in this manner. While the visitor claims Charles's property is hers, Joan asks how long this person has been freeloading. The staff reports the visitor has been stealing perfumes for months, but the pink-haired lady remains defiant. Gritting her teeth, the pink-haired woman accuses Joan of bullying her simply because she is lowborn. Joan looks down at her with pure disgust, debating whether to send her to prison or an asylum. The red-haired lady smiles as she hears the staff beginning to murmur about the scandalous visitor. The servants whisper and point as the pink-haired woman stands humiliated in the center of the room. Livid, the visitor wonders how servants dare to laugh at her and accuses Joan of playing games. The woman storms off, vowing that Charles will be furious when he hears about these public insults. A firm grip sounding, Joan grabs the woman's shoulder and prevents her from leaving the room. Joan orders the silver-haired man to bill the intruder for every stolen item or send her to prison. Joan demands that every member of the Pembroke family be kicked out of her business immediately. Turning to the staff, Joan warns that anyone who leaks trade secrets will face massive compensation claims. The silver-haired manager bows respectfully and confirms he will carry out the lady's orders. A soft rustle sounding, Joan releases her grip on the woman's shoulder as the confrontation ends. Walking away in a daze, the visitor wonders why Joan isn't afraid of making Charles hate her. Joan looks back at her manager with a smirk and admits she is not finished yet. With a determined look, the lady prepares one final gift to send to the Pembroke household. At a distant palace, the blonde-haired Charles eats cookies and wonders why Joan hasn't replied to him.
The pink-haired Gianna plots her revenge against Joan, determined to make her pay tenfold for past humiliations.
Charles approaches Joan in the courtyard, stating that he came specifically to meet with her.
Joan watches as the blonde man forces a visibly reluctant Gianna to offer an apology for her past actions. Charles scolds Gianna for her interference, while Joan argues that even royalty must apologize when they make mistakes. Clenching her purple dress in frustration, Gianna offers a stiff and insincere apology to the red-haired girl. Joan rejects this simple apology, threatening Gianna with prison unless she compensates for the family's business losses. A comical chibi Gianna fumes with rage, labeling Joan a bully and Charles a foolish man. Charles apologizes for failing his responsibilities as a fiancé and offers to accompany her to spring outings or banquets. Joan looks at him coldly, telling the blonde man that his change of heart has come far too late. Close-up on Charles's green eyes as he processes her firm and final rejection. He admits he neglected her feelings because she never complained or lost her temper in the past. Joan's gaze turns sharp as she questions if Charles is actually trying to blame her for his own ignorance. Charles denies the accusation and offers to escort her to her destination since the roads are muddy. Joan's expression suddenly brightens with joy as she spots someone important in the distance across the square. She identifies a bearded man in a plaid coat as the painter Camille Corot, the person she came to find. Waving her hand enthusiastically, the red-haired girl calls out to attract the painter's attention.
The bearded Camille is stunned to see a beautiful noble lady calling out to him in public.
Camille vainly wonders if the young lady is drawn to his artistic talent or captivated by his appearance. Joan ignores Charles to pursue the painter, leaving the blonde man confused about her acquaintance with the stranger. Charles stares blankly, unable to believe Joan would truly ignore him. A chibi scene shows Camille fleeing as Joan questions his sudden retreat. Her attention is taken by a sudden, loud laugh sounding from a group of men surrounding her. Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp crack sounding as Joan punches an aggressive man in the face. Joan stands her ground as the thugs begin to realize they picked the wrong target. With a swift motion, the red-haired girl kicks another assailant away. Joan confidently asserts that her reputation as a villainess was earned through her unique strength. Her attention is taken by a sudden, quick snap sounding as her high heel catches on the uneven pavement. Joan winces while clutching her leg, cursing the impracticality of wearing high heels during a fight. Her attention is taken by a sudden, heavy thud sounding as someone catches her from behind. Joan is surprised to find that Edward has arrived just in time to support her. The black-haired man gazes at the thugs with a cold, intimidating expression. The three men tremble in terror as the atmosphere suddenly shifts. Joan tries to push him away, urging the prince to leave so she can handle the situation alone. Edward remains unmoved, flatly refusing to abandon her in the dangerous alleyway. A comical chibi Joan tells the prince to use the thug's fear as an opening to escape. Edward questions if Joan looks down on his abilities while the thugs flee the scene. Watching them run, Joan realizes she may have underestimated the prince's impact. Edward stands tall over the defeated men, no longer the sensitive child Joan once knew. Joan reflects on the prince's growth, noting his imposing height, ruthless efficiency, and mature voice. Her attention is taken by a sudden light tap sounding as she takes a hesitant step back. Edward kneels to inspect her injury, and Joan offers her thanks to the crown prince.
He scolds her for her recklessness, questioning her decision to enter such a dangerous area unaccompanied.
A chibi Edward reminds Joan that her personal safety should always be her first priority. Chibi Joan argues about her freedom, but Edward insists that her current injury proves his point.
Joan dismisses his concerns and stands up to regain her composure.
Her purple eyes narrow as she focuses on the lingering threats nearby. Her attention is taken by a sudden, fast whoosh sounding as Joan hurls her shoe at the men. Her attention is taken by a sudden, sharp whack sounding as the heel strikes a man's head. Joan informs Edward she has business to attend to and won't be seeing him off. Edward expresses his frustration, stating he only wants to ensure she isn't hurt again. Joan clarifies that her dismissal isn't personal as she looks back at him. A chibi Joan teases Edward about crying, while he insists his damp face is merely due to rain. The red-haired girl gently places her hand on the prince's arm. Joan assures Edward that she values her life and would have brought protection if she had known the danger. She offers a warm smile, inviting him to accompany her in her search for the painter. Joan decides they will set out together as soon as the weather clears. Edward reaches out and pulls the red-haired girl close to him. Her attention is taken by a sudden firm grip, sounding as a hand seizes a travel bag. As they ride together, Joan realizes that Edward remains the loyal friend she has always known. At the Corot residence, Camille refuses Joan's request to paint, citing his retirement and artistic integrity. Joan boldly claims that while some things are difficult, money is never an obstacle for her. The bearded painter is stunned by the incredibly high fee Joan offers for his services. A comical chibi Camille immediately accepts the deal while swimming in a pile of gold coins.
Camille backtracks on his integrity, while Edward mentions that the palace also employs skilled artists.
The painter pauses, realizing that the name Joan sounds incredibly familiar to him. Camille recalls the terrifying rumors of a noblewoman who physically assaulted her former fiancé. He breaks into a cold sweat, fearing that Joan has come for revenge with a hired thug. A comical chibi scene shows Camille panicking while Edward holds him and Joan laughs cheerfully. Camille begs Joan to forget his past encouragement, fearing the consequences of her potentially antagonizing the royal family. Joan clarifies her presence is strictly for business, noting that she would have attacked immediately if revenge were her true objective. Edward attempts to reassure the trembling painter of his benevolent nature, but Camille remains unconvinced by the black-haired man's aura. The prince questions how Joan will handle the guild's skepticism,
but she offers only a mysterious and confident smile in return.
The scene transitions to the interior of a perfume workshop, where sunlight illuminates shelves filled with intricate glass bottles.
3 men voice their doubts to Joan, arguing that business carries too much risk for someone without her level of experience.
Joan stands her ground against the group, demanding to know if they actually read her written objectives before deciding to question her authority.
She sharply challenges their prejudice, questioning if they would be so bold in their opposition if she were a man.
The red-haired girl invites them to discuss concrete details like production and costs rather than hiding behind vague excuses.
Joan challenges the room to point out any unreasonable part of her plan, leaving the men trembling in a heavy silence. With her dominance established, Joan orders them to begin work immediately and threatens to fire anyone who dares to slack off.
A satisfied smirk crosses Joan's face as she realizes that her display of strength has finally brought the group to heel.
Joan winces as she notices a small, bloody scrape on her ankle. Edward kneels to tend her injury while Joan thanks him for his help. The prince asks what she was thinking coming to such a dangerous place. Joan explains her business errand while Edward urges her to prioritize her 50. Joan protests against staying home while Edward clarifies his worry for her well-being. Joan stands up abruptly and tells the prince that he has said enough.
A close-up captures the sharp, determined glint in Joan's violet eyes.
Joan swings her shoe with a fierce expression, preparing to strike a target. A sharp thud sounding, Joan's flying shoe hits a man in the head. Joan dismisses the prince while the unconscious target drifts toward the afterlife nearby. Edward laments being pushed away and asks Joan to be honest with him. Joan looks up with wide eyes, clarifying that she didn't mean to offend. Chibi Joan asks if Edward is crying, but he claims it is just raining. Joan explains she values her life and would have brought help if warned.
Joan decides to pursue the artist once the rain stops with Edward's accompaniment.
Joan sits in thought, her gloved hands resting on her lap as rain falls.
A firm grip sounding, the lady takes hold of a bag for her trip.
Riding through the blossoms, Joan reflects on her enduring friendship with Edward. At his home, the artist Corot refuses to draw books to protect his dignity.
Joan asserts that money is one thing she has in massive abundance. Joan offers an immense sum of money that leaves the retired artist speechless. A sudden jingle sounding, a mountain of gold coins pours over the artist. Buried in gold, the overjoyed chibi artist immediately agrees to the lucrative deal.
Corot claims he lives only for art, dismissively coughing away his sudden greed.
Corot speaks of lifelong art while mentioning the palace's own court painters.
Corot looks at the lady and realizes her name is strangely familiar. Corot recalls rumors of Joan beating her fiancé and fears her vengeful intent.
Observing the intimidating prince, Corot assumes he is the hired muscle for revenge. Corot faints in terror while the chibi royals loom over his unconscious form. Corot begs for mercy, hoping the crown prince will see justice done.
Joan explains she is strictly there for business, not for petty revenge schemes.
Edward insists he is not a bad person, but Corot remains highly skeptical. Edward asks about Merchant Guild doubts while Joan tells him to watch her. The guildmen doubt Joan's experience and suggest consulting the master of the house. Joan asserts her plans are documented and demands the men actually read them.
Joan questions if they would disregard her debt if she were a man.
Joan demands that only concrete and reasonable business questions be brought to her. Challenging the room, Joan asks anyone with a problem to speak up immediately. Joan orders the staff to carry out her plan or leave the business. Joan looks satisfied as she takes command of the room with absolute authority. A large crowd of ladies gathers outside the perfume workshop for the release. A staff member presents the new product featuring an illustrated book about Han. A purple-haired lady requests scent strips to sample the workshop's new fragrance.
The worker reaches for a sample to present to the eager noble customer.
The lady looks on with anticipation as the new perfume is finally presented. A soft rustle sounding, the worker opens a book of colorful scent strips. The noblewoman praises the scent while narration tells the story of Helen's birth. Illustrations depict Helen's unearthly beauty and the king who knelt before her. The legend describes how Helen's beauty ignited ancient hatred and a 10-year war. The story concludes that Helen belonged only to herself, represented by the perfume. The purple-haired woman blushes as a man's hand reaches out to touch her face.
Chibi scenes depict young ladies lost in romantic dreams and sugary dessert daydreams.
Holding up a decorative book, the purple-haired woman enthusiastically announces she is buying the perfume. Behind the counter, the shopkeeper suggests she take the picture book along with her purchase.
In the bustling shop, the man explains the scent testing book is a permanent gift. Other customers crowd the counter, clamoring for their own books and asking about prices.
Red-haired Joan reflects on the value of selling an experience rather than just a product. Near a carriage, a woman unintentionally drops a pamphlet onto the cobblestone path. A young girl in a pink dress excitedly discovers the beautifully scented book on the ground. Joan observes that physical marketing can reach customers hidden beyond the high nobility.
With a triumphant smile, Joan mentally reports her success to her father.
The golden light of a setting sun bathes the grand garden banquet.
Helen displays a delicate perfume bottle, lamenting the difficulty of obtaining the limited item. A soft whisper sounding, Helen's friends marvel at her stunning and refined new appearance.
Curious guests ask about the scent, prompting Helen's friend to offer an explanation.
Joan wanders the grounds while a tense confrontation unfolds near the trees behind her.
A man warns a weeping woman of discovery while she refuses to commit a sin.
Hidden by foliage, Joan freezes after accidentally overhearing a scandal involving a secret child. A dramatic shadow falls over a face as the weight of the gossip settles.
Joan greets a group of ladies, offering them samples from her workshop's first batch.
Helen stares in disbelief, realizing Joan personally designed and launched the viral perfume. With a calm and knowing smile, red-haired Joan confirms her role in the project.
The crowd murmurs in surprise, re-evaluating Joan's reputation in light of her business success.
Eager nobles surround Joan, questioning how she mastered the complex art of perfume making.
Smirking maliciously, the pink-haired woman tells others she has juicy gossip to share about Joan.
Joan fixates on a specific pair of guests standing near the banquet tables. Joan recalls Mary's history and her access to a physician she desperately needs.
Determined to save her father, Joan resolves to meet Mary no matter the cost.
Memories of a warm reunion with her father fueled Joan's drive to succeed.
Joan approaches Mary to introduce herself, but an angry woman suddenly charges forward.
A woman in blue glares at Joan, demanding to know why she is there.
The woman accuses Joan of spreading malicious lies to destroy her social standing.
Startled by the sudden attack, Joan asks what specific gossip is being discussed.
Bystanders whisper about Joan allegedly exposing an affair and a secret child to others.
Joan stands her ground, pointing out she doesn't even know the woman's name.
A sudden, firm bump sounding, the woman insults Joan and shoves past her. Despite the public humiliation, Joan remains focused on her urgent mission to reach Mary.
Joan apologizes for the chaos and offers Mary a perfume sample, but Mary refuses.
In the background, the pink-haired woman watches with delight as rumors begin to swell.
Mary stops Joan from leaving, scolding the crowd for their cowardice and love of gossip.
A sharp huff sounding, Chibi Mary fumes like an angry pufferfish while others cower. Looking on with fury, the pink-haired woman realizes her plans are being disrupted. Mary demands to know Joan's true motive for approaching her with a gift.
The Duchess questions if Joan is simply seeking some personal benefit or favor.
Joan admits she wants friendship and to borrow Mary's divine physician for her father.
Joan reflects on Mary's rise from an orphanage and her harsh reputation.
A sudden, quick grasp sounding, Mary accepts the friendship, admitting she has been very lonely.
Mary smiles at the idea of a villain duo teaming up against high society.
Mary declines the gift, explaining she won't trade a physician's help for perfume.
Mary introduces her family's doctor, stating that helping a true friend requires no conditions.
Red-haired Joan expresses her deep gratitude to a man for agreeing to investigate her father's worsening cough.
The goaded man reassures Joan, explaining that some illnesses appear more severe than they actually are and can be easily treated.
Blonde Mary scolds the man for his excessive talking, warning him that he might eventually annoy Joan.
Joan offers a kind smile and dismisses the concern, privately finding the unique personalities of her companions quite charming.
A silver-haired woman urges blonde Charles to follow his uncle's advice, emphasizing that family harmony is the key to prosperity.
The woman continues her lecture, questioning why Charles is arguing with his fiancée instead of sharing a drink with her. Charles agrees to leave immediately, hoping to escape any further lectures from the older woman. Charles approaches Joan and politely notices that her glass is empty, offering to attend to her.
Pink-haired Gianna interrupts to take the initiative, offering to pour drinks for both Joan and Charles.
Mary pulls Joan aside and warns her to be wary of individuals who show excessive, unprompted attention. Gianna maintains a friendly facade, claiming that her actions are purely out of care for her older sister. As Gianna pours the wine, Mary reflects on the woman's low social origins and her sudden, unearned inheritance.
A soft whisper sounding, the goateed man tries to stop Joan from drinking, though she dismisses his health warnings.
The man reveals the terrifying secret that the wine in Joan's glass has been intentionally poisoned.
Joan remains remarkably calm and asks about the specific type of poison and its immediate physical effects.
The man explains the chemical properties of the slow-acting toxin before Mary interrupts his detailed medical explanation.
Joan reflects on her previous life, where she frequently used alcohol as a way to escape her deep-seated sorrows.
She recalls how, in the past, her drinks were always delivered by servants, leaving her vulnerable to tampering. Joan realizes that her past symptoms of insomnia and confusion were likely the result of a long-term poisoning scheme. At the end of her first life, her mind was so clouded that she could only remember a few significant things. She vividly remembers the scent of flowers and the special perfume that Edward used to send her out of concern.
Joan concludes that by making different choices in this life, she has successfully forced the hidden conspiracy into the open. Joan challenges Gianna to prove her sincerity by being the first one to drink from the poured glass. Gianna makes excuses about her tolerance for alcohol, prompting Joan to accuse her of trying to cause a public scene. Gianna asks Charles for support, but he points out that she recently purchased a large quantity of champagne. A soft murmur of laughter sounding, the other guests at the banquet begin to gossip about the tense situation. Mary asks Joan if the public whispering makes her angry, but Joan expresses a complete lack of interest in the gossip. Joan decides that she has no desire for revenge and refuses to waste energy on people who are irrelevant to her. Joan's focus shifts elsewhere while Charles tells Gianna that she should be the one to drink the wine. A soft melody sounding, the scene transitions to a childhood memory of a formal dance lesson for young nobles. A sharp yell sounding, young Joan accidentally steps on her partner's foot during the practice sessions. A young boy with freckles argues with Joan about her lack of cooperation, but she insists he should be matching her movements. The boy boasts about his superior family rank, leading young Joan to crossly state that she doesn't care about his status. Young Edward observes the bickering children from a distance, watching the scene with quiet interest. Young Edward approaches the group and offers to become Joan's new dance partner for the lesson. Joan tells the first boy to forget about their partnership as she turns her attention toward Edward. Young Edward offers a confident smile and claims that he is actually quite proficient at dancing. Joan warns Edward about her dancing skills while reflecting on her long history with the boy she once considered a sweetheart. Joan questions whether her past affection for Charles blinded her to any potential wickedness in his character. A sudden, quick stomp sounding, Joan steps on her partner's foot while considering the financial benefits of the Mortimer family fortune. The two children continue to dance together, surrounded by a magical atmosphere of glowing white flowers. Back in the present, Joan holds her glass and resolves to test the situation to ensure her own safety. Joan suspects Gianna's direct involvement in the poisoning and wonders if Charles was an accomplice to the plan. Joan pointedly asks Charles if he is the kind of person who would actually want to poison her to death. Mary tells Charles that if he drinks without hesitation, it will be seen as an admission of his own guilt. Gianna watches the confrontation from the side, secretly relieved that the pressure to drink is no longer on her. The goated man is overcome with panic, wondering if he should inform the mistress about the developing conflict. He decides against it, knowing the mistress would only create a loud and public disturbance if she found out. The socialites at the banquet continue to spread malicious rumors about Joan's reputation and her past behavior. The guests mock Joan's efforts, waiting for her to make a fool of herself in her pursuit of a man. Blonde Charles drinks champagne while red-haired Joan watches with a narrowing violet eye. A sharp clatter sounding, Joan aggressively strikes the champagne glass from the blonde man's hand. Joan stands over the shattered glass as Charles demands to know what she thinks she is doing. Joan and Charles face each other as she declares the wine is poisoned and she must speak up for safety. Joan questions if Gianna only poisoned her glass and asks why the culprit didn't dare drink the wine herself. A loud shout sounding, pink-haired Gianna screams that she is being slandered while Joan and Charles watch. A sharp gasp sounding, the chibi guests descend into a comical state of panic and distress. While guests panic about having drank poison, Joan promises to arrange for doctors to examine everyone. A physician among the crowd notes that only Gianna's wine seems problematic, urging the guests to stay calm. Gianna and a guest argue, with the guest wishing death upon her, while Gianna mocks her private affairs. A sharp gasp sounding, the brown-haired woman is horrified that Gianna was eavesdropping on her. Guards lead Gianna away while she shouts that she is doing everyone a favor by forcing them to reflect. Charles watches Gianna being escorted away, realizing she framed Joan and is far more calculating than he thought. Charles recalls a memory of Gianna whispering that rumors matter more than the truth in ruining a reputation. Joan asks Charles if he thought she was a co-conspirator, but he claims his feelings are deeply hurt. Joan rebukes Charles for bringing his mistress to a family banquet, while he claims he only wanted to be responsible. Locked in a dark cell, pink-haired Gianna sits on the floor lamenting her sudden bad luck. Gianna sits miserably behind bars, wondering why Charles has not come to save her yet. A sudden footstep sounding, Gianna is overjoyed to see Charles and begs him to take her out. Charles demands to know why she committed such a crime, but Gianna tries to dismiss it as unimportant. Charles berates her for lacking regret, while Gianna asks why he is there if not to save her. Close-up on Charles's cold green eyes as he declares she committed a crime and deserves judgment. A desperate gasp sounding, Gianna is horrified as Charles refuses to help and prepares to leave. Snapping with rage, Gianna points at Charles and calls him a useless, rich idiot who she shouldn't have chosen. Charles stands by a fountain at night, looking exhausted and troubled as he rubs his head. A soft rustle sounding, narration describes how easily Gianna manipulated social classes by weaponizing their obsession with reputation. The scene shifts to a bottle of wine on ice as the narrative continues about protecting a count's name. Recalling a night together, the text notes that Charles is more childish than others for prioritizing responsibility. Flashback shows Gianna threatening suicide to manipulate Charles, laughing at how easily he fell for her innocent facade. A large text box prominently features the word house against a dark, ornate background. Narration lists the luxuries Gianna gained, including clothes and a secret marriage over a bucket of ice. Livid, Gianna screams that Joan was right about him being a fairy tale joke, while Charles finds her vicious. Gianna glares with cold, glowing eyes and tells Charles he brought this miserable ending upon himself. A dark-cloaked figure, revealed to be Joan, stands silently in the shadows of the dungeon corridor. A wicker basket filled with cookies is left on the floor outside the iron bars of the cell. A firm footstep sounding, Charles walks away while Gianna falls to her knees and begs him to wait. Clinging to the bars, Gianna desperately admits she was wrong and begs him not to leave her. Charles continues walking as Gianna claims she has turned over a new leaf and learned her lesson. Gianna rants about how Joan enjoyed a life of luxury, while she spent half her life in misery. A close-up captures the intense, furrowed brow and emerald green eyes of the frustrated blonde man. Gianna asks if he didn't come because he loves her, questioning if love is supposed to be unconditional. Charles declares he never felt love for her, only responsibility, and ends their connection completely. Charles regrets wronging Joan while the red-haired lady watches the scene from the shadows in her cloak. Charles dismisses Gianna's gold-digging behavior, telling her she can keep the gifts as he leaves. Charles hopes she changes her life, while Gianna realizes she has lost her leverage over him. Her hand trembling, Gianna reaches into the basket of cookies to calm her fraying nerves. Gianna bites into a chocolate chip cookie, determined that there is still a way to survive. Gianna declares she has information regarding safety and demands to be released in exchange for the truth. Gianna begs to be sent abroad in exchange for her secrets, while Joan's violet eye watches intently. A violent hacking sounding, Gianna coughs up blood into her hand as Charles watches in sudden horror. A cry for guards erupts as someone discovers poisoned cookies, leaving a young blonde man in total shock. Guards rush to the scene while a piece of the lethal treat is discarded amidst dark splatters. Cloaked in black, red-haired Joan is barred from entering the site by the palace sentries. Joan maintains a cold and unyielding expression despite the chaotic surroundings. A silver-haired man arrives, embracing Joan and scolding the guards for treating families so frostily. Uncle Roger accepts blame for the banquet's tragedy, promising Joan a full investigation into Gianna's death. Roger becomes overly dramatic about the danger, prompting Joan to silently judge his flair for the theatrical. They discuss Gianna's fatal poisoning, which the silver-haired man dismisses as simple karmic retribution. Roger questions a guard for eavesdropping, but the man explains he has a message for John. The guard presents Joan with silver needles from Prince Edward to detect poison at future events. While Chibi Roger weeps with guilt, the guard confirms he has permission to speak openly. Roger listens intently to the mention of the Crown Prince's personal concern for his niece. A quiet transition occurs as the scene shifts toward a more contemplative environment. Back in her study, Joan reflects on her past life's obsession with revenge, now finding it worthless. She grows suspicious, questioning how a commoner like Gianna could infiltrate a noble banquet so easily. Joan suspects a hidden benefactor provided Gianna with a key and an undetectable, slow-acting poison. Her steward approaches, his reflection visible through a keyhole perspective as he enters her private space. The man in glasses prepares to deliver an urgent report regarding the family business. He warns Joan that competitors are already copying her methods and a former partner is being disloyal. A chibi painter abandons his contract for more gold, reveling in his sudden, greedy wealth. The steward worries about luxury marketing arms races as other brands release increasingly opulent booklets. Joan remains calm, listening to the mounting challenges facing her perfume enterprise. She explains that brand awareness was only the first phase of her complex marketing strategy. A blonde maid asks how Joan intends to leave a permanent, special impression on their customers. Joan reveals her plan to design bottles so beautiful that buyers will never want to discard them. She proudly announces the completion of a new, intricate draft for her bottle designs. The maid is astonished by Joan's artistic skill as a chibi Joan shows off her work. Joan dismisses her talent as mere patience, comparing it to the simple act of braiding hair. To truly succeed, Joan decides they need a designer with a name that carries significant noble influence. Her thoughts turn toward blonde Charles, identifying her ex-fiancé as the most suitable candidate for the job. The maid questions why Joan is hesitant to work with the man who recently broke her heart. In a chibi struggle, the maid reminds Joan she has no noble reputation left to worry about. With a final push, the maid sends Joan off to confront Charles with an iron fist. Now in a blue gown, Joan prepares herself to handle those who might offer her attitude. She is greeted by overly attentive maids, making it impossible for her to act with any hostility. The maids present Joan with her favorite items, having meticulously memorized her long-standing habits. Joan realizes just how much she once felt at home within these familiar, welcoming walls.
She firmly informs the staff that she will never be the lady of this house again. The maids laugh off her warning, assuming she is merely venting and will marry Charles anyway.
Joan is left speechless and frustrated by their complete refusal to take her words seriously.
One maid happily directs Joan toward the study where Charles is currently wicking. Joan enters to find Charles slumped over a desk, reaching listlessly for a plate of donuts. Charles is visibly startled to see Joan standing there after everything that has happened between them.
Joan ignores the awkwardness, offering him a professional commission that he immediately rejects due to his depression.
Chibi Joan scolds him for being uselessly sad over being tricked by a copper.
Charles wallows in his self-pity, admitting that his current state is indeed pathetic and weak. Joan watches him, genuinely surprised to see such a broken and defeated side of her former fiancé.
A sudden loud bang sounding, Joan slams her palms onto the desk to get his attention.
She asks what it would take to cheer him up, and Charles sheepishly admits he likes sweets.
Joan orders him to eat a massive spread of desserts until he recovers his fighting spirit.
Charles asks Joan if she was always this fierce, noting she never used to insist on her opinions with him. Joan states she has always been like this and asks if he has a problem with it.
Charles reflects on Joan's constant criticism and admits he didn't realize how fragile and imperfect she truly was. Charles apologizes for never truly understanding her, admitting he was never perfect either. Charles asks his boss what design she wants, and Joan explains she needs more than just a few words to start.
Joan describes the need for a unifying design for perfume bottles that stands out in the current market. Charles acknowledges her dedication to the business, while Joan warns him not to slack off on paid work.
Charles asks to talk more soon, and Joan agrees to meet anytime starting the next day.
Charles mentions an upcoming play Edward will attend, and Joan recalls her uncle mentioning it too.
Joan expresses surprise at Mary's talent for drawing a large audience to her stage play. The story continues as the scene shifts to the day of the much-anticipated theatrical performance. Edward stands outside the theater while guests arrive for the afternoon show. Joan arrives at the theater and calls out to Edward with a warm, bright smile.
Edward asks Joan if she is all right following the recent poisoning incident at the banquet.
Joan dismisses his worry, insisting she is completely fine and the incident is already over.
A soft neighing sounding, the black horse pulls away from Joan's reaching hand. Joan is annoyed that the horse won't let her pet it despite having fed it before.
Charles joins them and suggests they all head inside since they are so eager for the show.
Charles questions watching the classic play again, but Edward claims he never tires of things he truly likes. Charles realizes Edward came for Joan and questions if staying interested in something actually leads to a result.
Joan interrupts their tense bickering and urges the men to hurry inside as the show has already started.
Edward gently pets the horse and tells it to be good and cooperate next time Joan touches it.
Joan explains that because the theater is small, only 2 seats were available together, while the third is in the front.
Charles suggests the front row seat go to Edward since the Crown Prince is a rare and honored guest.
An intense silence falls as the 2 men exchange a sharp, competitive glance in the darkened theater.
On stage, actors duel with swords while shouting about arguments and the dangers of a serious blade. Charles asks if Edward's love for art means he wouldn't want to miss seeing the performance clearly.
Charles insists on sitting by his fiancée, noting it is inappropriate for Edward to sit with another man's future wife.
Edward remains silent, his expression darkening as Charles asserts his claim over Joan. The play continues on stage as an actor mocks his opponent for being weak and spineless before a duel.
Edward suggests letting Joan decide the seating arrangement while the theater owner nervously observes the royals.
Searching the room, Edward asks where Joan went while Charles looks around in surprise.
A red arrow points to Joan, who has already seated herself alone in the middle of a row.
Charles watches Joan from the back of the room while the theater owner peeks through the curtains.
Charles pushes the owner toward Edward, suggesting the prince talk more about the play with him.
Joan watches the performance and thinks that the large crowd has made the theater uncomfortably warm.
Charles sits next to Joan and offers her a glass of water to help with the stuffy air. Joan takes the glass and asks if Charles came up front because he couldn't see from the back.
Charles admits he came specifically to go out with Joan and that he simply wants to be with her.
Joan admits she no longer cares about his motives, and Charles asks how he can make things right.
Joan explains that broken things can't be made whole, and there is no need for apologies or reparations.
Charles concedes to Joan's coldness and promises to speed up the process of breaking off their engagement.
Edward watches the stage from afar while observing Charles and Joan sitting together in the audience. A sharp creak sounding, Edward's hand grips the edge of the seat with restrained frustration.
Edward resolves that if this is her choice, he has no right to interfere with her life.
Edward turns to leave the theater while the confused owner tries to call him back. Joan suddenly looks toward the back of the theater as if sensing a presence. Joan looks around and wonders where Edward went as the play continues in the background.
Standing in the rain, Edward reflects on the reported annulment and wonders what is happening between the two. Edward questions if Charles was merely acting and lying to Joan all along as the rain pours down. A sharp click sounding, blonde Charles greets the crown prince as they meet once more. Charles walks past Edward in the rain, his expression unreadable as he moves toward the interior.
Edward glares with a dark warning, stating that any harm brought to her will carry an unbearable price.
Red-haired Joan peeks out from behind Charles and curiously asks what the two men are discussing. Charles explains that Edward is simply inquiring about the details of their latest perfume project. Charles announces that the theme for the new fragrance will be titled First Love. Charles suggests that the prince describe the scent he envisions for such a romantic theme. A soft gasp sounding, Edward imagines a fragrance defined by sweet and fresh floral notes.
Joan rejects his idea, claiming he has the entire perspective of the product backwards.
Narration explains that the perfume is designed for the wearer's pleasure rather than to attract others.
Charles describes a unisex scent of leather and musk before showing the prince a refined design draft.
A sudden, quick swipe sounding, Edward reaches out for the paper, only for it to be moved away. Charles complains of exhaustion and demands a reward, while Joan asks if he is referring to dessert.
In a playful chibi scene, Joan notes his short work hours while Charles seeks her personal encouragement.
Chibi Edward stands alone, fuming in silence while the others continue their lighthearted banter. Edward decides to leave to visit his uncle, offering Joan a parting wish to stay healthy. Late at night, Joan slumps over her desk in the cold room as rain pours outside. Trembling from the chill, Joan prays that her physical exhaustion is not developing into a fever. Alone in the dim lab, Joan worries about the unfinished accounts left on her desk. Joan lies unconscious in her bed while two maids prepare to care for her. Edward enters the room and asks about her condition, startling the two maids into a bow. Bearing a large bouquet of narcissus, Edward learns that the doctor has already prescribed Joan rest. Edward sits by the sleeping woman's side, gently holding her hand as the room remains quiet. Edward watches Joan sleep, worriedly noting that she is at risk of catching another chill. Edward is startled by the heat radiating from Joan's hand, realizing her fever is dangerously high. As soft rustle sounding, Edward carefully pulls the white blanket up to cover her shoulders. Joan remains lost in a feverish sleep while the morning light begins to filter into the room. A gentle clink sounding, Edward uses a cooling orb to soothe her while lamenting his helplessness. Edward watches her with a pained expression, his eyes filled with a deep, silent longing. A soft whisper sounding, Edward pleads for her to recover as quickly as possible. In a memory, a young Edward complains about the repetitive flowers and fairy tales Joan brings him. Young Joan firmly tells him that since he is sick, he has no right to complain. Young Edward dismisses her presence as forced, while the young girl admits she finds the visit boring. Young Joan declares she only stays because she wants to, regardless of any orders from the king. Young Joan demands to know if he understands her, leaving the young boy speechless and wide-eyed. A soft flutter sounding, Joan's eyes slowly blink open as she begins to wake from her sleep. Joan realizes her fever has broken and she feels significantly better as she holds the cooling orb. Joan recalls hearing a voice during her fever and asks if the person she heard is present. Standing by the window, a man with red hair and a mustache confirms he was the one speaking.